The G7 meeting continues here today, and this picture says it all. The Secretary of State and foreign ministers from every country posing for a very COVID-era photo. A little awkward looking, but it is a show of unity in the face of an equally daunting task. The key theme of the summit is to promote democracies in a world where autocracies seem to be gaining strength. And the group has admitted some friends, top diplomats from other allies, South Korea, South Africa, Australia and India, all to help figure out how to do that. Driving the point home, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is sending a message to autocratic Russia by visiting democratic Ukraine tomorrow. Now, few people know more about threats to democracy than the former CIA director John Brennan. His book is called Undaunted, and he is joining me now from Washington. Welcome to the program, Director Brennan. Can I ask you first, you've written Undaunted, you see what's going on by the, Secretary of State, the foreign ministers. They have a big task, literally how to underpin democracy. Just give me a sense of how strong you think the autocratic threat is.
Well, Christiane, I do believe that the autocratic threat around the globe is quite significant, which is why this G7 Foreign Ministers Summit is so important. It will be the first convening of this group after the rather bizarre 4 years of the Trump administration. And I fully expect Secretary Blinken to take a leadership role because there's great commonality of interests among those 7 countries. And so the United States needs to lead the way and to ensure that the democratic governments that are of greatest that has greatest concern right now about what's happening around the world, that they forge a consensus about how to deal with this rising authoritarianism. So I do think it's a very important and critical meeting that is taking place in London.
Just very quickly, do you think that under Trump, you said the unfortunate 4 years of Trump, those autocracies were emboldened, not just ideologically, but actually in terms of operationally?
Well, I do. I think Donald Trump demonstrated his own authoritarian tendencies and did not really have much respect for the rule of law here in the United States. And so I think he was emboldening a lot of authoritarian leaders around the globe. Look at the way he dealt with Vladimir Putin. As well as with other authoritarian leaders. So I do think that those leaders were given a pass during those 4 years and decided to further their authoritarian actions. Now, under President Biden, I think the United States is going to take a much different tack in dealing with these authoritarian regimes. And that's why gathering together with the United States' closest allies and partners is critically important to make sure that they are able to forge this consensus position to push back against authoritarian tendencies around the globe.
So they did talk about Russia and China and those challenges. And as I said, they invited 4 other allied nations, and most of those, in fact, they're all from Asia or Southeast Asia, right? So it's that area. The consensus seems to be that China is the one that poses the biggest threat. And the Secretary of State said that China, the one country in the world that has the military, economic, diplomatic capacity to undermine or challenge the rules-based order represented by the Western alliance. Do you agree? And if so, how does one confront China?
Well, I think as Secretary Blinken said in an interview over the weekend, the United States is not trying to keep China down. It's trying to do what it can to make sure that China plays by the rules of the international order so that as it continues to expand its economic reach, its political influence, and even its military capabilities, it's not going to flout that international order and use its muscles to be able to intimidate and bully other nations. So I do think the Biden administration is going to take a much more sophisticated approach toward China, try to cooperate where we can, confront the Chinese when we must, and hopefully avoid conflict over some very thorny and sticky issues such as Taiwan, Hong Kong, and cyber.
So those are very, very, I mean, that's a very full plate to try to manage. And I don't know how successful previous US administrations have been. They've all talked a big game, and yet we're still in this position where China is, a competitive, challenging threat. And I did hear what Secretary of State Biden said. They're not trying to contain it or confront it. But again, how then do democracies manage balancing competition, versus the aggression that China, competition on the aggression and also cooperation in areas that they need to cooperate on?
Well, it is a difficult balancing act. There are some very thorny trade issues, economic issues, financial issues when it comes to dealing with China, making sure again that it's not going to use its heft to try to circumvent some of the international rules and regulations that have been in place. And so it needs to be brought up to date. China is much different than when it joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization, about 20 years ago. It is now a much more competent economy with much broader reach around the globe. And so therefore, I think the G7 nations, along with a lot of other countries around the world, are concerned about these Chinese activities. And they're looking to the United States to lead the way in terms of forging this consensus so that China realizes that it's not just dealing with individual countries, it's dealing with an international consensus that China must mend its ways.
As you say, thorny. I mean, I just want to pose a question that has been raised by some. Can you ever imagine, you know, in the not too distant past, because you mentioned Taiwan and other so-called thorny issues, these are war and peace issues. Taiwan, China has made it very clear, do not get involved. This is our, you know, our property. And others have, you know, are worried now that there might end up being some kind of war between the US and China. Do you think so? I mean, you've war-gamed all this stuff as director of the CIA.
Well, I think Donald Trump, there was a lot of rhetorical broadsides that he would hurl around the globe and a lot of just rhetoric, and I think some hollow threats. President Biden is a very, very experienced international statesman. He understands these issues well. He's not going to bluff. He's not going to bluster, but he will send very clear messages, both publicly and privately, to China that it should not try to change the order right now in some of these issues as far as Taiwan is concerned, Hong Kong. Joe Biden is not going to be looking for military confrontation. At the same time, he recognizes that the United States has extraordinary responsibilities around the globe to protect international peace and stability. And so therefore, I think China and President Xi Jinping understands that Joe Biden is a much different statesperson than Donald Trump would even wish to be. And Joe Biden is going to deal with these issues, I think, in a very pragmatic, but also in a very determined fashion.
I mean, they're not thrilled that Biden keeps the same certain economic policies and trade tariffs on them. But let's just move on, because obviously the Biden administration signaled very, very clearly that they want to move the bulk of their activity and vision from the Middle East, where much, you know, American forces have been concentrated for decades, and you know, look towards China. But the Middle East does keep pulling the US in. Talking about democracy, Israel has not yet stood up a government. The Prime Minister has a deadline of tomorrow to do so. The Palestinians have just announced they're cancelling their much-delayed elections. How important is it for the Biden administration, sorry to say, to have to keep focus on peace, security and democracy in that region?
Well, I think the Middle East overall is a critically important area for United States national security interests as well as for international interests. And therefore, I think the Biden administration is going to continue to work these issues, whether you're talking about the Iranian nuclear deal or you're talking about Iraq and Syria, Yemen, Saudi Arabia. But on the Israeli-Palestinian issues, I think the United States has really special responsibilities to try to do what it can to bring some resolution to the issue of the Palestinian people. The United States is the main supporter of Israel. It's Israel's security guarantor. And for generations, the Palestinians have been looking for their own sovereign state, their homeland. And unfortunately, as you pointed out, Israeli politics seems to be in a never-ending deadlock. The Palestinians, unfortunately now, Abu Mazen, President Abbas, has canceled the elections. And I do think it's important for the Palestinians to field a new slate of candidates for their legislature that will lead the Palestinian people into the future as opposed to trying to relitigate the past. At the same time, I think Israel, as the occupying power of the West Bank and Gaza, has a real responsibility to try to do everything possible to give the Palestinian people their much-deserved rights.